Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Saturday, March 30th, 2024, and today we are going to be taking a look at the 2024 presidential election. This video is going to be my election prediction for the 2024 race as of today. How do I think the election is going to go down if all of the voters got out to the ballot box and cast their decisions in the election today? Now, I emphasize that because I think looking ahead to November, the numbers can be very hard to predict. I think while there are a bunch of different factors that go into the decisions behind why people vote a certain way or are supporting a certain candidate, I do believe that a lot of what will matter to voters will arise right after Labor Day in that final stretch of the campaign season. All of this is pretty much a culmination of the efforts of both parties to win the presidency in the 2024 race over the past 3 years, where President Biden stands, where President Trump stands, and overall what the election will ultimately end up being, at least in my eyes, if voters were to make that decision right now. And so I also will say the reason why I'm making this prediction today and not at the beginning of April, if you're new to this channel, I pretty much release these predictions once a month and in the final stretch of the campaign season every 2 weeks going into the election so we can track the progress of certain candidates over time. And my reason for doing it at the end of the month is just because April 1st was the day I was supposed to make a video, and I didn't think anyone would believe me if I released it on April Fool's Day. So that's a bit on that side, but you will start to see a prediction come out probably in about 2 to 3 weeks as we get more numbers in, as we ramp up this general election season. Donald Trump and Joe Biden were declared the expected nominees. They've won and clinched the nominations through delegate count around the middle of this month. And so it's the first time we've really seen this full-on matchup here. My last prediction was around a month ago, so I'm excited to finally have one for the month of March. And I do, I will say, you should expect some updates in terms of some characterizations. In some states, will be interesting, are actually moving in different directions that you might not necessarily be seeing from the national headlines. Now, this video, I think we are going to spend very little time talking about the states that we really don't need to be talking about. States like Illinois and Maryland that are ultimately going to go to the Democratic Party practically no matter what. That's how these elections go, and that's how a number of states are decided. They've been decided for months on end going into the election. And so these are states where you really won't see much investment from national Democrats, national Republicans, with the exception of a few competitive races. In states like Montana, there's an interesting House race there and a very competitive Senate race there the Democrats will be paying attention to, but won't necessarily be investing on the presidential level, which honestly I think for both parties is good. It allows them to focus on narrow states and focus on states that, have a disproportionate amount of power. That's the whole product of the Electoral College, but I think it's very interesting to see just exactly how much money gets poured into these races. I'm not going to comment on if that's good or bad for the state of our democracy, the state of America, the state of money in elections, but I will say it's certainly interesting to view from an analytical point of view. Continuing on to some of these safe red states, safe blue states, these are states that really shouldn't shock you, are states that really aren't going to go no matter what happens on the national level. Donald Trump could be behind bars. Joe Biden could, decide to step down and not run for the nomination and decide to have an open convention. And, so many different factors at play here. I still don't think any of these states that we have characterized thus far are going to change. These are states that are just so ingrained to be very Democratic, very Republican, and that's the way that our nation is. But in these remainder 232 electoral votes, just so happens to be the same exact number that Hillary Clinton got in 2016 and Donald Trump got in 2020, is the exact number of competitive electoral votes that are on our map here. States that are ranging from a variety of different districts, like Nebraska's 2nd to Maine's 2nd district, to states like Arizona, to Virginia, to Minnesota, states that will not be decided by what we declare to be safe margins. Anything 15 points or more are going to be decided by that point and essentially are not at all within reach for the opposition party. And so we do have states, though, that do come down to what we call to be likely states. These are states where you have, overall expectations that a certain political party would win them, but in some hypothetical, the opposition could win them, right? These are states like Virginia, for instance, which in the last presidential election voted for Joe Biden by 10.1%, probably won't be narrowing down to anywhere in the lean margin of 1 to 5%, and will still likely be going to the Democrats. Things have not fundamentally changed since the 2020 election in terms of how candidates are perceived by a lot of these states that are likely states from the last race. A lot of them are going to pretty much be solidly, still voting for this candidate. The question is, for some of these states, do they narrow down? Do they get closer? Does Joe Biden make improvements? Does Donald Trump make improvements? And you can start to see that in the margin, but overall, their chance of victory here is still going to be relatively the same. States like Colorado and New Mexico also join the likely blue column. States like Minnesota as well. New Hampshire actually I think is a unique one because typically it's a very, very competitive state. In 2016, it was the narrowest state in the entire election, decided by 1,000 votes. Raw vote margin, at least the narrowest, not necessarily by percentage, but a very, very close battleground state. Hillary Clinton, though, ended up winning. In 2020, it shifted quite significantly to Joe Biden, a 7.3% margin of victory, significantly better than Hillary Clinton's, and also had down ballot effects that benefited Democrats up across the state. So New Hampshire is, you find here a Democratic state from 2020. The polling numbers seem to indicate that not much movement has happened at all. And I think a reason for that, too, and what you're finding in these likely blue states, is states like Minnesota and New Hampshire share a commonality in that they are overwhelmingly, or disproportionately white, right? You find that these are states where there are a high white population that are Democratic voters that typically are not swayed as much by a lot of what we're seeing on the ground here when it comes down to battleground states, where you do find a reversal in support in states like Michigan, in Dearborn, in the Arab American community, in states like Pennsylvania, where you're seeing a good chunk of black voters disengaged with this election compared to the last one. That doesn't matter as much in Minnesota and New Hampshire in the sense that these are states where you have a higher white population, you have a higher Democratic-based population that is older compared to other states. A lot of states rely on young voters. A lot of states rely on minority voters. And while Minnesota and New Hampshire do, in a way, I will say they rely on them less. And that also means that in terms of polls, you do see less movement in sort of Democratic support amongst Democratic bases here. You do find that Joe Biden's approval rating is higher. Why might that be? Well, because a large chunk of voters that are disapproving of President Biden from the left, self-identifying Democrats, self-identifying left-leaning individuals, will say that these are, the reason they're upset with Biden is because he's not progressive enough, because of his stance on the war in the Middle East, because of the stance on issues like healthcare, his stance on the issues like the border. In states like Minnesota and New Hampshire, it matters a lot less. It also matters a lot less in states like Colorado and New Mexico, even with high minority populations. You find that because there is a large chunk of support in suburban regions outside of the state, you do see very minimal movement compared to the last election because, for whatever reason, certain states care about things on a different level, right? I will say that when you take a look at what issues matter to voters the most in states like Virginia, in Colorado, in New Mexico, Minnesota, and New Hampshire, it's not all the same. But you often find that some of these states do value things like abortion a lot higher than others. States like Michigan, for instance, cared about abortion a lot more in the 22 midterms than a state like Texas did about the southern border. And that's why you did, in fact, see differences in shifts. Elections, even in the 2021, you didn't see a uniform shift towards Joe Biden. Some states like Florida, for instance, shifted towards the right? It's very interesting to see, but I think it goes to show that there's a variety of different reasons as to why these states are voting blue, but a lot of it has to do with the fact that what they care about right now are not necessarily things that Joe Biden is being perceived as doing poorly. I think that's largely the reason, too. I think that's going to be a very, very prominent reason why Joe Biden will still do very well in a lot of these states, why you won't see much shifts, and the same reason why Donald Trump, in just a moment, when I characterize his likely red states, you aren't going to see major movement as well. Because I think this is exactly why states like Iowa and Ohio really haven't shifted away from Donald Trump, despite being states that were competitive in 2000 and 2004, went to Democrats in 2008 and 2012, and then in 2016 made a major shift in the rightward direction and have maintained that rightward leaning bias in favor of Donald Trump, in favor of the Republican Party. And a lot of the reasons to that is because these voters think the Republican Party is doing something right. Voters in Georgia, voters in Arizona may disagree. Swing voters may disagree. The swing voters in these states clearly care about different things, clearly are voting on different things, and Donald Trump has won them over on those issues. I will also say that you have found a unique sense of political power for Republicans in Florida over the past 4 years. The Florida of 2024 is not the Florida of 2020, and it is certainly not the Florida of 2016. The last time Democrats did very well in Florida, and I say that with caution because they have not won a statewide race since 2012, was when Hillary Clinton was on the ballot. She ran up the margins, and in a lot of districts, actually, you saw them shift to the right relative to 2012. And that makes sense. Barack Obama won the state in that election, but I will say Hillary Clinton, when you look at the shifts from 2020 to 2016, was significantly better than Biden, especially in Miami-Dade County, especially in regions of the state where you had a high Latino population that turned away from Joe Biden, turned away from the Democratic Party. Miami-Dade County, the largest shift we've seen out of almost any county in the country here, shifted 22 points more Republican here. That was significant. Hillary Clinton got more raw votes in 2016 with a lower turnout race, more raw votes here than Joe Biden did in 2020. And that's because a lot of those voters that were all in for Clinton were all in for Trump. And that has maintained itself. Ron DeSantis, Marco Rubio have won in this state by nearly 20-point margins in 2022. That's significant, right? States like Texas, too. You find that Greg Abbott did phenomenally well in 2022, given the circumstances. And I will say, he certainly did show some signs here in Texas that it was shifting towards the leftward direction, but Texas still ultimately was a red state. and it will ultimately be a red state in 2024. I don't think Joe Biden is going to get or win over voters more, especially on the southern border, especially on the issue of immigration. Texas is one of these states where Democrats, in the right scenario, could be able to win, could be able to at least narrow it up to the way they did in 2018 when it went down to being a 2.8% margin with Beto O'Rourke on the ballot there against Ted Cruz. They're not going to see that for a while. Democrats have not been able to tap into the electorate there as much as they were able to in the past, and I think that's a problem, but it's one that Joe Biden himself is not going to be able to overcome. And so Donald Trump wins Texas, he wins Florida, he wins Iowa, he wins Ohio, but now in these remaining states, I don't think any of them are really going to be likely or safe. The rest of them are truly going to be as contentious as they've always been, with the exception, actually, sorry about this, Maine's at large and Maine second. These are the way they voted in 2020. Again, Maine, I think, is actually one of the states similar to New Hampshire and Minnesota, very high white population, one of the highest in the states, in the country. And so Maine, I will say, is likely to revert to their priors and vote the exact same way they did in the last election, and that's what the data seems to suggest. Now back to this, talking about these remaining 94 electoral votes from Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada. These are the states, and Nebraska second. These are the states and districts that Joe Biden and the Donald Trump campaign are spending so much money on. Spending tens of millions of dollars in. The Biden campaign in these states that I've highlighted, the same states in the toss-up column, Joe Biden has allocated $250 million in ad spending in the final 3 months of the campaign. Donald Trump is eyeing up a $33 million fundraiser in Florida to spend money on these states as well. You are finding that these are the highest profile states and districts for good reason, because genuinely they could go either way, which actually, I will say, is good news for Biden right now. The reason I say that is because he did win a lot of these states back in 2020. But the polls seem to suggest that at this point, maybe they should be written off. Maybe states like North Carolina should be completely abandoned in the effort to play defense and win states like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And while some people in the political space are of that opinion, I'm not. I believe that Donald Trump could run up this map, winning these 94 electoral votes, putting him in a good position. I think if you saw that happen, what would that be? The total number of electoral votes, 313, right? If Joe Biden was to win those 94 electoral votes, you'd hover around 319. And so it's roughly the same amount. You're starting to see exactly, where they're doing good, where they're doing bad. But I think it's very possible that Biden wins all of them and Trump wins all of them. But I don't think that's going to be happening. I think you are going to see by the end of this that there is going to be a clear advantage point for Joe Biden, a clear advantage for Donald Trump in these districts, in these states, as of right now, as of where the election is today. And I think that's going to be very hard to predict getting closer to, especially with some of these states. I think I've already come up with a characterization, so I know what the map is going to be before you see it, but they're close, exceptionally close, which means they are swayable. I would lock in on them today. If I had to put money on it, I think my map I would lock in on today. But I don't think that's what's going to be happening in November. I think it's going to be what's happening today. And that's exactly why these things are so important. I think that these are the types of things that you're going to see happening on the internal of the campaign. This allows them to figure out what's our priority. What's a state where we've seen a decrease in support? I think it's going to be quite interesting. So getting into it, not wasting any more of your time, let's start off with the states that we consider to be lean red or lean blue. Essentially states we expect to be decided between a margin of 1 to 5%. And right now, it's not that many. I told you these races are going to be close, but we can kick this off with two states that I think are going to be lean red, and that's North Carolina and Georgia. Now, I will say, Georgia, I think, is going to vote to the right of North Carolina as of right now. And I know I might get, attacked for that in the comments, and maybe rightfully so, depending on what happens this November. But I will say, Georgia does not have a coinciding race that can benefit Joe Biden up ballot. Essentially here, what the thinking is, because there is an unenthusiastic electorate, there is no major calls to prevent Donald Trump from winning the presidency again, as there were back in 2020, that I think Georgia now, because there's no Senate race, because there's no governor's race, because there's no prominent election on the ballot here, Joe Biden is here to fend for himself. In North Carolina, though, there is a crazy, and pardon my language for a moment, batshit Republican that is deciding to run for office in this state, won the Republican nomination, and I could not find a worse Republican nominee for the North Carolina GOP in that governor's race. And why does that matter? Well, it could narrow up the race in 2024. It could narrow up a race that I think otherwise should be easily won by Republicans in a state that is historically very conservative. And I think that's going to be a problem here for the Republican Party, because it means there are a bunch of different issues here that will come up as problems with the North Carolina GOP. Their state superintendent candidate has called on the, called on death of presidents, right? You have people here who have made insensitive remarks. In some cases, anti-Semitic remarks, sexist remarks. The Republican nominee for governor here, the day after he won his primary, the Democratic Party released opposition research that showed that he said he wishes he could go back in a time when women had no right to vote in America. That's what Democrats are working with here. And I think it genuinely will narrow up North Carolina enough that it benefits Joe Biden up the ballot. I think that's going to be a very interesting phenomenon that will be unique to this election because that's historically not been the case. But I think it will happen in states like North Carolina and not just here. In states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, where you have Senate races on the ballot, popular Democrats on the ballot that are expected to do tremendously better than Joe Biden. And I think it will narrowly help him. And that's why I think North Carolina right now will vote to the left of Georgia. But of course, time will tell, and I haven't always been right about North Carolina. I said that it was going to go blue in 2020, but, I'll take that, and we'll see what happens. So, humor me for the rest of the states. I know, again, you might disagree with me, and I'd love to hear your opinion on this, of course, in the comment section. But I think where we are right now, we're now down to states that can't be decided by lean margins. I think Nebraska's 2nd District, I probably should have done this way earlier on. I wanted to spend more time talking about it because I think it will be interesting if it does, in fact, narrow up. It's a likely blue district. I should have characterized that. I apologize. I will say, though, in the map you are going to see, I think it will matter a lot more. It's not going to be a tie or anything like that, but I think it will certainly make an impact if we do start to see some states shifting over, which you'll know exactly what I'm talking about, and I'll talk about it right at the end. I don't want to spoil it, but let's keep going. So in these remaining 61 electoral votes, these are also states that I think Democrats and Republicans both think they have very, very good shots at winning. And they're right. These are states that have been extremely competitive in the past few election cycles and also just recently have shown that they aren't exactly enthusiastic about Joe Biden, but they have not reached majorities yet for Donald Trump. What's unique about North Carolina and Georgia is that in both of the averages here in the polls, Joe Biden is losing, and losing with Donald Trump in the majority. He's capturing over over one half of voters in these states. That is not the case in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Nevada and Arizona. There's significant room for growth here for Joe Biden, and I will say he probably is going to get it as we get closer to the election cycle. But again, as of right now, Donald Trump is in a good spot. Donald Trump is in a good spot right now. I think he wins the state of Arizona. That's not changing from my last prediction. I think it's going to be very close. It's 11 electoral votes here. Democrats have shocked us before. I think they could do it again. But right now, you are seeing a state that Joe Biden won, get this, by 0.23%. I'm not going to say here is going to be a state that you are going to find, or 0.27%, something like that. Very, very, very close. Donald Trump is probably going to win it right now. You've seen improvements. You've seen increases in support with Latino voters, not only in Arizona, but across the country. In states like Nevada, in Florida, in Texas, it's a consistent thing, and it's a problem that Democrats need to come back. But right now, the state of Arizona, I believe, leans right. With it, I think this might be more surprising. My last prediction, I had Nevada blue. I no longer think that is the case. Nevada has seen a since recent influx in support for Donald Trump. I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that there is now a reversion in support from Latino voters that are now turning towards the Republican Party. Democrats, though, have a very strong track record here. I very, very, very rarely bet against Democrats in Nevada. I didn't in the 2022 midterms. I didn't in the 2020 election. I didn't in 2018 either. I tend not to because I know that the Democratic force here is amongst the most powerful. But I will say, the numbers I'm seeing here are alarming. Jackie Rosen is significantly outperforming Joe Biden, and it doesn't seem like it's going to be close on the presidential. I think it will be. I think Donald Trump will win this state by less than a point, but Joe Biden absolutely has a chance of victory. But as of right now, if I was to call it, I'd say Nevada's going red. And so that's our first flip right now, going towards the Republican Party from the last prediction. The last one I had Nevada blue, but we probably aren't going to see much else. Arizona, Georgia flips to the Republican column from the 2020 election, but Nevada's the one where we've seen now an improvement for Trump over the past month. I will say, though, his improvements aren't uniform. In fact, there are some states where you're going to see that the shifts here are moving in the opposite direction. To start off strong, we had the state of Pennsylvania, which is a state that I would put now in the lean column. Not tilt, not toss-up. I would say it's lean blue. And I know this might be surprising, but taking a look at recent data here and looking at historical data and looking at the past 6 months, this is the best performing swing state for President Biden, and they severely underestimated Democrats in the 2022 midterms and was spot on in the 2020 election. It's one of the states that was perfect in terms of average, to a T in 2020. Then in 2022, he found here that they predicted that Oz would win, lost. Predicted that Josh Shapiro would win by 8, he won by 15. Overall, across the state, in the state House, in the state Senate, they did not predict things correctly. The congressional races went to the Democratic Party. They tied the state. Ultimately, Pennsylvania went blue. And so Pennsylvania, I believe, Joe Biden wins by a lean blue margin, anywhere between 1 to 5%, probably around 2 to 3, but I actually think he improves off his 2020 margin of victory. Might be surprising to some. I will say, though, that's where I'm at in Pennsylvania. I think you've seen consistent support across the state. You've not seen a decrease in support for even people like Senator John Fetterman. in states like Michigan, where you probably would see a much more active pushback against him because of his stances related to the Middle East, related to Israel. I think in Pennsylvania in specific, you have not seen the shifts you have seen in the other Rust Belt states, and there's a reason for that, whether it comes down to demographic, whether it comes down to overall electoral history, whether it comes down to the fundamental fact that Joe Biden is from Pennsylvania. There are so many different factors here that I think explain why Joe Biden's power and prominence maintains itself in Pennsylvania. And I think there's a lot more that we can unpack when we do more close-up statewide analysis leading to the election. That's important context. But right now, Pennsylvania is a lean blue state. And so that leaves us with 25 electoral votes. I'm going to go out and say it. I think Wisconsin is going to stay blue. The numbers here have reversed in favor of Joe Biden. You've seen significant improvements relative to the most recent polls that we've seen. And so I think Joe Biden here is doing strong enough in Wisconsin. I think you're going to see a near identical margin. I will also say, too, minority communities are pivotal to Democratic victories in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, and based on the numbers we're seeing, based on the crosstabs we're seeing, it does not seem to have eroded in terms of Democratic support as significantly by a ton. A significant difference between the erosion in support in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania compared to that of Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada. And so I think that's the main reason why those states are going red and these states are going blue. Wisconsin is one of those states, too, where you do see that white suburban voters are shifting in favor of Biden more than they did in the last election and could very well counteract for a dip in support in Milwaukee, or the same thing in Pennsylvania that could counteract for a dip in support in Philadelphia. Now, Michigan is the killer. Michigan is the one that I think Donald Trump wins and gets over the top. And I know this might be the most shocking part of it, that Michigan is going red and Wisconsin is going blue and Pennsylvania is going blue. If I told you this a year ago, if I told myself this a year ago, I would have laughed in my face. I would have said, there's no way. This is a state that has voted more for the Democrats, least for Trump, right? This is a state that has just been fundamentally the bluest out of them all. And so what happened? Well, I think a lot happened. And I think looking at what we've seen in terms of reversion in support, it specifically matters a lot in Michigan because Democrats can afford to lose some levels of support amongst minority voters in Milwaukee, in Philadelphia to an extent. If it is counteracted and exceeded by white suburban voters, just as we have seen in states like Nevada, where you did in fact see a reversion in support in 2020, you did see it in Florida, especially Miami-Dade County. How did Joe Biden end up keeping it within 3 points? Well, that's because other parts of the state shifted left. I think Michigan, though, it's too much. I think right now you are seeing that voters are very upset. The uncommitted vote here is very, very high. I will say, too, in Minnesota, the uncommitted vote was very high, but this was not an extremely high turnout primary at all. There was no effort from the Biden campaign at all to counteract what was happening in this state. I will acknowledge it and absolutely say that that matters for Democrats, but I think fundamentally when it comes down to Election Day, I could easily see Joe Biden crossing that 5 to 6% threshold and getting in the likely column. In Michigan, I don't. I think given that the uncommitted campaign was last minute, that we did see a large number of Michigan, representatives, Michigan voters out there, prominent electoral officials in this state, especially in the regions the Democrats, again, rely on for support. Regions like Dearborn, regions like Detroit. You find that Democrats here are much more enthusiastic, and a lot of it has to do with Joe Biden's stances. And I think that is going to be a problem that Biden has to combat and fix in time for the election if the race is to go blue. And so Joe Biden, I think today, stands at 255 electoral votes. Donald Trump today, I believe, stands at 283. It's going to be a close race. It's going to be exceptionally close. We are probably going to be up for hours on end into the early, probably late hours of the morning, honestly, watching these election results pour in. Wisconsin, Michigan, Arizona, Nevada, these are states, though, that are amongst the closest. These are the tilt states and genuinely could go either way, which means as of right now, it's anybody's race to win. Donald Trump may have the upper hand now, but come November, only time will tell, but I don't know if the map will look this way. I genuinely don't believe it will. I think we're going to see a lot more states shifting in favor of the Democratic Party, of the Republican Party, depending on what happens between now and November 5th. But as of today, March 30th, 2024, this is my election prediction, and you're free to agree or disagree. Please let me know down in the comment section. I'd be very interested to see, what you think about this map, what anyone thinks about this map. But as of today, this is where I'd lock in. Donald Trump 283, Joe Biden 255. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.